Today what we're going to deal with is a systematic and theoretically informed analysis of socialism and communism. Topics that have been difficult to deal with in a systematic and theoretically sophisticated way for a long time. Basically, the Cold War made it impossible for most of the last half century, in the sense that all that anybody seemed interested in was which side were you on. You tended to have people who didn't like the Soviet Union denouncing everything, and those who felt protective towards the Soviet Union celebrating everything. And it was very hard in that process to come up with, on either side, anything like a reasonable effort to see what that extraordinary experiment running from 1917 to 1989, the longest lasting so far, that may change, but the longest lasting experiment in putting socialism into practice on a mass scale in an entire and large country that we have. And so it's an important experiment to understand. But before jumping into that, what I want to do is talk in a more general way about socialism and communism. I'm going to start talking about them together. As we go along, you'll see how they become differentiated and what the differentiation between those two terms means. But first of all, looking at them together, I think it's best to see socialism and communism as the kind of shadow of capitalism. That is, it's what in fancy language you might call capitalism's other half, other side, shadow, irremovable presence that capitalism doesn't want but cannot ever separate itself from. Marx is a product of capitalism settling in Europe. If you look at his personal history, if you look at his timing of his life, he's literally a product of capitalism at that time, and most of socialist movements, organizations, and individuals have been products of emerging literally out of capitalism as it evolves. I think it's important to see that. And perhaps the best way I know of to put it is something like this. Every institution, large and small, has in our society and in past societies, people who love it and people who hate it. And the dialectic, the contradictions of societies make it not all that surprising that that would be true. There are, for example, an awful lot of families or kinship groups in which some people admire and love that institution, and some people hate it. Some people locate their good points in the institution that they got, and some their bad points. It is not surprising, it is not unusual that any social system breeds, if you like, its critics and its advocates, its admirers and its detractors. And capitalism has always done that. By the way, slavery did that. Those who extolled it as a wonderful system, and those who hated it. Feudalism had those, and on and on and on. For those of you that are not familiar with it, all of those systems, like capitalism, have not only provoked people to be critical, but have provoked people to try to overthrow the system, to break away from it, to destroy it. All slaveries are full of that. Whether you go to ancient Rome and you know the story of Spartacus, the rebellion against slavery that Spartacus as a slave leader undertook, or if you know American history, John Brown and what he was trying to do, and countless others. Wherever slavery has existed, it has produced its supporters, its admirers, its celebrators, and its critics, and its revolutionaries. Feudalism has countless upheavals where serfs tried to get rid of the capitalism. In fact, the feudalism, one of the most famous books of Friedrich Engels is a study of what he calls the German Peasant Wars, where he talks about the role of peasant uprisings in shaping the history of German feudalism. And again, there are countless examples, and capitalism has had that as well. We will talk about the Soviet, and what we say about the Soviet Union will have a lot to say about China and Eastern Europe and Cuba and so on as well, but they are really only recent, long-lived, cataclysmic uprisings against capitalism. There have been thousands of them in the long history of capitalism, wherever it has been. So in one sense, and perhaps in the most important sense, socialism and communism are words to describe that part of the spectrum of opinion in capitalism that is extraordinarily critical. And I think it is important for you to see them that way as part of an evolving social dialectic in which systems arise, provoke criticism, and eventually succumb to that criticism, which is often what happens. American slavery was overthrown by a revolt of parts of the society against that slavery. And the same is true wherever these systems have been, that we should say. Second point. Whenever you had critics or antagonists of a system, like capitalism, and the same is true of slavery, feudalism, and so on, they typically fall into two major groups. And I think it will help us in our discussion of socialism and communism to talk briefly about what those two groups are. The first group is critical of what it sees and demands an amelioration, a softening, an improvement, progress, lots of words. They want the system to change to better treat the people that live in it. So, for example, in the struggles around slavery, the critics of slavery, one group of them, out of the two groups, I'll tell you the other one in a moment, one group was determined to get better diets, better clothing, better conditions, less breaking up of families, to make the experience of the slave less onerous, less awful, to improve, you might say, to be cute, to produce slavery with a human face. So it's a criticism of slavery that pushes for an improvement in the quality. Same thing in feudalism, to have the serf have more of the fruits of his own labor, to be less oppressed by the lord, to be less required to make payments to the lord, and so on. In capitalism, there's a group of critics who demand higher wages, better working conditions, improved pensions, subsidized housing, you know the list. Demands for the improvement. Then there's another group, a second group of critics. Their concern is not primarily with improving the conditions of the mass of people within a society. They're interested in transforming that society, changing it systematically. And their arguments are roughly the following. The system breeds the bad conditions. Even if it were possible to improve the conditions of the mass of people within the system itself will undo the very reforms, you see where the language is coming, that you can achieve. Those good or better conditions will always be dependent on how the system is working and how the people who run the system feel about those conditions. Or to say it real simply, to raise wages in a system that's a wage system always allows for the time to come when the wages will be reduced. You haven't institutionalized your improved situation. You haven't made it the system. You have left the system in place so that the improvements are always dependent on the system. Or to say the same thing using the passionate language that usually gets involved here, consider the struggle between those who were critical of American slavery in our South, who demanded better conditions for the slave. Now imagine yourself in the presence of a room where a John Brown or someone like that tears his hair out and screams, the problem is not to improve the condition of slaves, The problem is slavery, and that's an abomination that has to be ended. It's not how we treat the slave, it's that there is such a thing as a slave, which is intolerable. And Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slave. He did not spend a lot of time passing laws to improve the conditions of slaves. In the intensity of the Civil War, he simply said, there is no such thing, and the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits slavery as an absolute. Well, not quite. If you read that passage, that amendment, the 14th, it allows for, it bans slavery everywhere except in prisons. That's still the law of the United States. We can have slavery in prison. There are actually several places where we have slavery that are allowed by law, but in general it's banned. Okay? So, in the history of capitalism, the same thing. There are those who want, often in the name of socialism or communism, or not using those names, it's not necessary, they're not the only names, but this group of critics want to improve the condition of working people in Canada. Higher wages, better working conditions, more civil liberties, you name it, you know them all. And then there's another group who sometimes take the name of socialism and communism, sometimes don't, for whom the issue isn't to improve the condition of workers in capitalism. The problem is there ought not to be workers in capitalism. There shouldn't be people who depend on others to hire them for their life. The workers should not be in that situation any more than the slaves should be the property of another person. And that's the issue. Now, often, these two groups collaborate. They see a commonality. Those who want to improve work on that. And side by side, those who want to revolutionize the system, transform the system. So, if you like, to make permanent the reforms, to guarantee the reforms, to embed them in a different system, those people work on that project and they work together. And if you want, you could use names like reformists for those who want to improve the condition, and revolutionaries, those who want to change the system, and they work together. They consider their two goals, their two foci, their two projects, as what you might call a short-term and a long-term project, or a smaller and immediate and a larger and social project. There are various ways that they build a coalition and work together. They can even have fun, as when the reformists turn to the society they're trying to change and say, you better give us the reforms we're demanding, or else you'll have to deal with those other people, and they want a lot more. That game is played all the time. But even more often, they do not get together. They do not cooperate. They criticize one another. The reformists attack the revolutionaries. You want the whole thing. There's not going to be a revolution. We don't have the strength. The other side isn't vulnerable. It's too dangerous. It's too horrible. Whatever the reasons. And therefore, what's achievable is reform. So stop wasting everybody's time waving the slogans and storming the barricades. You can't get that, and it is foolish and dangerous to try. On the other side, the revolutionaries. You don't know what's achievable. You don't know how vulnerable this system is. You don't know what is possible. All you're doing is giving up what we really need and going for small potatoes. And being really happy if you get them. And mobilizing masses of people to spend enormous effort to get something that isn't secure. And you're only gonna depress them, frustrate them, and turn them off. Not only will they not be militants for the revolution, you won't even keep them as militants for the reform. You reformers need us to be here every bit as much as we need you to be there. And why would the revolutionary admit the reformers necessary? because reform is something people can immediately see, they can immediately benefit from. They may get active in a particular political movement around immediate issues much quicker than they might get around the bigger, more abstract, more total kind of change. So maybe getting involved in reform could be a stepping stone, a step in the process that ends up with a revolutionary. When they work together, they've looked at it that way. But their working together is always fraught with the tension of these two groups' different perspectives. And the smart people on the other side, those who wanted to keep a society going, have always understood the importance of playing on the difference between these two groups. Saying, for example, to the reformists, you're good. You're not like those dangerous people with bombs in the back of their pocket threatening everyone. And if you're nice, and you stay as a nice reformist, here's what we're going to do. We'll give you some reforms, smash the hell out of those revolutionaries. You don't protect the revolutionaries, we'll give you some of your reforms. How's that for a deal? Often that deal is taken. And that will help split, of course, the revolutionaries and the reformists when they don't do that to themselves. In the course of the struggles between those who want to change the system they're critical of and those who want to get rid of that system, they come to use a variety of names. One of the earliest differentiations between communists and socialists was around that issue. Socialists, in general, but not always and not everywhere, but socialists in general tended to be the name increasingly used, particularly over the last century, for the more reformed criticisms of capitalism. Communists for the more revolutionary. But again, please understand, there are times and places, including today, when it doesn't work like that. When in fact what the Communist Party does is less revolutionary than what people who call themselves socialists or a socialist party do, and so on. These are very flexible, changing labels. So if you ask yourself, what does it mean, you're asking the wrong question. There is no "it means," as if there's a fixed definition of these things. The terms socialism and communism got caught up, like every other piece of language, in these conflicts, which is why I stress the history and the conflicts rather than the particular words. Okay. There are other differences in this socialism and communism that we can now talk about. First, if you go to one of the most widely influential statements of what socialism is, if you want that, it is this famous pamphlet that's on the reading list by Friedrich Engels called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's a pamphlet, it's not that terribly long, written by Engels with Marxist participation in the middle of the 19th century. And it's a very powerful attempt to really survey what socialism has meant, but from a very partisan position. Engels there and Marx are trying to welcome but also criticize a kind of socialism they think is, to use the best word I can think of, immature, underdeveloped, needing change. They recognize that it has been a powerful movement drawing in lots of people to be critical of capitalism, and for that they applaud it. But its way of doing that, they think, is ill-advised, and they want to change what the term means. Hence the funny second part of the title of the pamphlet, Utopian versus Scientific, or Utopian and Scientific. What did Engels mean? In his view, the socialism that preceded it, and that is associated with names like Cabet, Fourier, Saint-Simon, the French, in England, Robert Owen, and a whole host of others, many of whom are mentioned in the pamphlet. He says the problem with them was they reacted to the horrors of capitalism mostly by either describing or envisioning, or actually even trying to create utopian alternatives. So if capitalism is awful, I'm going to use now modern language to show you how contemporary all of this is. Let's embody what we seek to have in our own daily practice. Let us have here a commune. That'd be a word you could use. They didn't, but that would be a modern term. Let's organize our household this way. Let's organize our little enterprise this way. Let's have a good society, a decent society, a socialist society, by which they meant a society that was the negation of what existed, capitalism that existed. Robert Owen, if you're not familiar with it, actually created factories in England that were run on radically different principles than your conventional capitalist factory. And there was a great debate in England about whether the living conditions of those workers and their attitudes towards one another and their whole personalities were different, and therefore validated the notion of socialism as a better system or not. And all kinds of people, including very famous people in the history of British thought, weighed in on that debate. Marx and Engels were quite critical. Even though they felt quite close to these socialists and had grown up reading them and excited about them, they were critical. They became critical. And their criticism was that these people thought that you would win masses of people to the socialist cause by painting, mostly in words and images, and sometimes creating a little community that would embody the nirvana, the socialist alternative, and people would come to that. And Marx and Engels said that's not the way it happens. Revolution is going to happen because people in the situation they're in begin to move, and it is crucial for revolutionaries to understand how and why people move in the situation they're in, so that they can figure out how to help them go from whatever is their immediate concern to the longer, much more difficult process of social change. The trick for revolutionaries is then to identify who in the society is in a position to move, who is at a place, because of what he or she does, to be, if you get the message here, provoked by the contradictions of capitalism to want change, even if the change begins by being small. The trick is to identify who these people are. Where are the contradictions? And which of them give us the best chance to work with them, to build them into a larger revolutionary movement? That's what we ought to be doing in socialism. And for example, out of that came the idea that one of the main tasks of socialist theory is to identify the agents of revolution in the current situation. Who is going to do it? Where are they? How do you get to them? What do you do as an activist to reach them, to mobilize them, etc.? They wanted the kind of practical, their phrase, scientific, by the way, in the middle of the 19th century, nothing was better than to be scientific. You were no longer religious, obscurantist, old-fashioned. You were modern, rigorous, and scientific. Remember, the 19th century hadn't yet seen the kinds of wars that science can produce, the nuclear bombs it can produce. So science had a better name than it has in the second half of the 20th century back then. So theirs was a scientific, try to understand what's actually happening in the society and not spinning lovely pictures of ideal society. By the way, for those of you that are interested, such was the influence and power of Engels' pamphlet, reproduced in many languages in millions of copies spread around the world to this day, but particularly in the first 75 years after it was written. Such was its influence that in the whole movement inspired by Marx, there has long been a tendency to be suspicious, critical, hostile of utopia, of the whole effort to prefigure. And in a sense, you could say, I would, an overreaction, a realization too late, that utopia is a very powerful idea in the human mind. Human beings confronted with the horrors of daily life imagine something else. the language in our modern culture would perhaps use the word fantasy. A fantasy of how life could be. And that is a powerful part of life and enables people to make criticisms of society and to take steps which would not be taken so quickly were they not able to construct and dwell individually and together on utopian fantasies. And it is very dangerous for a leftist movement to go too far away. It's not that it's to detract from Engels and Marx's criticism, but to see their more nuanced balance might be a better way to go. In any case, one of the profound effects of Engels' pamphlet was really to change the whole notion of socialism and communism and capitalism, and to bring forward something that had existed before, but he really made a central point, and this is crucial. Ever wonder to yourself about the very words socialism, communism? Now, clearly something's going on here. You're using a word that is stressing the group, the society, the community. Socialism, communism come from the root social and community. So if that's one thing, what is its opposite? What is it the other of? Well, the answer isn't capitalism, it's individualism. The real dichotomy that Engels brings forward is in a society built around the individual as opposed to a society built around the community. And that much of the development of socialism and communism has to do, and had always had to do, with a notion that somehow the priority ought to be given in policy, in culture, in economics, to the community, the needs of the group, not the needs of the individual within the group. So that socialism and communism locked easily over into egalitarianism, the notion that we should all have roughly equal life chances or opportunities or resources, rather than allowing some to be very rich in those things and others to have none. All of that is wrapped up here, whereas the individualism isn't focused like that most of the time. So socialism and communism have this focus on the group as the prior or the priority, and not so much the individual. Capitalism comes to be associated with that more individualist. Now again, you have to be very subtle here, because in some societies, capitalism isn't viewed as an individualism, but a different kind of social organization, etc., etc. But this is a dichotomy that Engels makes use of and that socialists have always made use of. Even more important than that, in Engels' pamphlet, there was a notion of the particular difference, when you get away from the abstract, the group versus the individual. There was a particular notion of how socialism, because the term communism was not used much in those days. Everybody who was a critic of capitalism in those days, sort of on the left end of things, called himself or herself a socialist. The word communism doesn't really become important until later. By the way, it existed earlier, but it doesn't become an important concept in this world for quite some time. So socialism, what does Engels say about it? Well, socialism is the negation of capitalism. Very important. Capitalism comes on the scene. It provokes a criticism of itself, its own contradictions, its own failures, its own flaws provoke criticism, and then the critics seek to make change. The system resists, the critics fight harder, and you build up an explosive negation of capitalism. Very Hegelian. The thesis, capitalism, the antithesis, the critical attack on capitalism, and then the synthesis, the transformation of capitalism by its critics into a new social system, a new thesis, for those of you who like to play with the philosophy. How did Engels specify the way socialism is the negation of capitalism? He answered it by focusing on two things. First, he focused on the state, the government. in his mind, clearly, what supported, what secured, what protected capitalism against its critics was the state. The capitalists, when challenged, in the factory, in the office, on the streets, in the town, in the state, in the nation, turned to the state to protect them, with the police, with the courts, with the military, the whole apparatus. And so it became clear to Engels and Marx that one thing that the revolutionaries have got to do is deal with the relationship between capitalists and the state. That became a central concern. And the idea began to evolve, partly in Engels' work, partly in all those who took and ran with the ball that he had written. The idea began to develop that the socialists need to somehow get a hold of the state apparatus. If they don't, they will always have that used against them. And so it becomes necessary for the socialists, in negating the capitalist system, to put a particular emphasis on the state. As this idea was developed from its initial phases, again, both in Engels and also in other people, more in some than in others, more in Engels in some ways, less in others, it took the following two forms, two focal forms of what the state could do, would do, needed to do, if it was to become not an agent of protecting capitalism and preventing socialism, but the opposite. If the mass of workers could take the state, phrases like seize the state, smash the state, if the workers could take the state, and by the way, why would workers even be thinking like that? Because the bourgeois revolution that had overthrown feudalism brought in the whole apparatus of parliaments, voting, and suffrage. And of course, the more you give suffrage to the more people, the more that begins to become at least a potential way for the mass of people to get a hold of the state. So the idea was, if the workers could do that, and there of course were great disagreements on how the workers would do that, I'll get to those in a minute, but put that aside for a minute, if the workers could get the state, what would they do to negate capitalism with that state and to set up socialism? And two things emerged as the focal points. And they have defined socialism and communism to this day. That's why I'm spending time on it. Number one, property. Capitalists, in the minds of the mid-19th century, own the means of production. They own the factories, they own the machines, they own the money, they own the tools and equipment, they own. And by virtue of owning, they have immense power. The mass of people can't produce anything unless they have access to the means of production. But the means of production are the private property of a few people, the capitalists. The only way the workers can ever get access to the means of production without which they can't survive, they can't produce food, clothing, and shelter, if they don't have the means, well, the only way to get the means is to beg and plead those who own them to part with them. And those who own them, what ownership means, don't have to provide them. They can sit there and gaze at the machine all year in blissful happiness at its lovely contours. They can hold on to their land. They can close their factory. That's what private property means. So the first focal point that became very powerful in the socialist movement was, we have to separate the capitalists from their private ownership of the means of production. And the state is how we're going to do it. They will stop being private, they will become the state's property, and because we will control the state, they will therefore have become, ipso facto, the property of the people as a whole, and that would never be allowed to be withheld from the people to force them into making deals, such as, if you let me produce here, I'll make a surplus for you, just pay me a wage. Because a wage is better than you're holding back the means of production for me altogether, because in that case I starve. That will be over because we will, and now notice an interesting, funny ambiguity in the history of socialism. We will socialize the means of production, almost used synonymously, we will nationalize the means of production, even though it's actually quite different. In one case, the state, the nation takes it. That's a different matter from the society takes it. But the words in practice became the same. The socialists were in favor of the socialization or the nationalization of the capitalists' private property in the means of production. Clearly affirmed by Engels, a central program in all socialist parties, really for the last 100, 150 years. When François Mitterrand becomes the president of France in the 1980s, as the head of the Socialist Party in France, the first few days he's in office, he seizes the private property of the 10 biggest industrial combines in France and declares they are now the states, in the name of the French people, with all the drama that French presidents do everything. Whether it's running off with Italian models, at the level at which current leadership functions, or something actually historically interesting. So here we have a central idea that socialism is about a movement focused on the state to socialize, to take over private property. Second big idea. Capitalists rely not only on their ownership of the means of production to reproduce themselves and to reproduce capitalist society, but they rely very powerfully on another institution that works for them, but keeps the mass of people down, poor, underdeveloped. And that institution is the market. The market. This arrangement that capitalism has, in the minds of socialists, a footnote. That's a mistake of socialism. Markets have existed with all kinds of systems. They have nothing particular to do with capitalism. You can have markets without capitalism, loads of examples. You can have capitalism without markets, plenty of examples of that too. So it's a little bit of a mistake, but you know, in the excitement around building a movement, all kinds of mistakes are made, always, by people left and right. I'm just pointing that one out, because it's actually important, as you'll see later. But Engels' argument, and the argument of socialists in the second half of the 19th century, was that capitalists use the market to screw everybody. They get more for what they sell than they ought to. They pay less for what they buy than they ought to. They use this mechanism, and it works this market in two ways that we hate. Number one, it seems to be a way of reproducing the extremes of wealth and poverty. You know, if you're rich, you go into the market, you can get whatever you want. If you're poor, you can't. And because you're poor and you can't get things in the market, you can't acquire the mechanism to become rich. So the market, in a sense, sediments you, cements you into an unequal society. That's how they understood it. It is the devil's tool. It's a capitalist institution that serves them and screws everybody else. The second critique of the market was the notion that the market is inherently chaotic. Marx himself loved the word anarchic. Anarchic. There's no control here. It's anarchy. Everybody does whatever they want. They hold things back to jack up the price. They dump things when they need to lower the price. They make a deal with another person in the market to screw a third person. The market is a chaotic activity, and you know it's chaotic, and you know it's irrational. Human beings don't live like that, because periodically the market blows up. Every 3 to 7 years, this capitalist market has a meltdown. Millions of people, like today, get laid off. They want jobs, And the rest of us would like to have the goods and services they could be producing. So they want the jobs, but they don't get them. We want the fruits of the labor they'd like to do, but we don't get that. Meanwhile, roughly a third of our capacity to produce tools, equipment, factories is sitting idle. It is lunacy to have unmet needs, people who want work, and all the raw materials and equipment needed to produce it and not get these together. The market, the socialists said, is the chaotic institution that imposes on the people who live in capitalism, imposes these periodic downturns, recessions, depressions. That is irrational, inefficient, unfair, and something that needs to be overcome in the interest of the mass of people. It only serves the capitalists who know how to make money when the market is doing well, and also make money when the market isn't. Some of you may have seen an article I wrote that spread all over the place the last 2 weeks, in which I did a little statistical study here in the United States, based on work done by Merrill Lynch and Capgemini, two very large corporations, who proudly announced that in 2009, the 1% richest Americans recovered nearly all of the money they lost in 2008. Nobody else did that. They did that. It's important that's why I wrote the article, to understand that the way markets work, it allowed the 1% at the top, people who had more to do with producing this crisis than anybody else, have been able to do better during it than everybody else as well, and are coming out even richer than the rest of the people than they were going in. Right? For socialists, this was all evidence that the market is an institution that should be removed. And therefore the idea, socialism is an effort to capture the state to do two fundamental things: transform private property into social property, and replace markets with rational government economic planning, so that you don't have the chaos and the business cycle and all the rest of it. Socialism then, in the second half of the 20th century, when it took off as a social movement, between 1850, when there were a few socialists in few parts of Europe with no power, to the end of the century, 50 years later, by that time, the most developed, the two most developed economic countries in Europe, Germany and Britain, had the two most developed socialist movements. The Socialist Party in Germany was contesting for power, was picking up 20 to 50% of the vote, depending on the election. In England, it was more nuanced. They didn't have a Labour Party and so forth, but they too were a powerful social force. And so this was a time of extraordinary success. It terrified the capitalists, who watched the growth of the socialist movement all around them, here in the United States as well, and took all kinds of steps to try to hold this back, to understand this movement, and to fight against it. But the big explosion comes in the beginning of the 20th century, with the Soviet Revolution. There were other revolutions before, important ones. Important one in Turkey, all kinds of things. But the big one was in the Soviet Union. Before I get to it though, let me summarize. Socialism, if you listen to what I was saying, with its focus on the state, and its focus on big changes, who owns the productive property, markets versus planning, this is what economists call macro-level theory, macro-level strategy. It's the idea that the way you achieve socialism is by changing the big picture. Notice, please, with me, what is not being discussed, the details of what goes on in the factory, in the office. What are the relationships between the manager and the worker, between the owner and the worker, between the owner and the manager? What? Is that all what? Well, the actuality, if you study socialism, you realize that wasn't what they were interested in. It's not that they had a strong position one way or the other. That was not the focus. The focus was this larger strategic, macro-strategic idea. And socialism focused on that. It did not deal with, and I'm going to to come back to that, with the level of what happens in the individual workshop, in the store, in the factory, in the office. What is a revolution against capitalism? What does it mean there? It's almost as if, I'm going to push it a little, it's almost as if that didn't matter. That was somehow not a social issue. What goes on in the factory is given by technology. You know, you produce in a certain way, so you have to have two people over here because the machine works this way and one over there. And it's kind of, it's not an interesting topic because we didn't discuss as socialists the chemistry of production processes either. So it was looked at as though the relationships in the guts of production weren't an important central issue for socialists to have much to say about. Yes?
Well, I just had a slightly different understanding of Marxism in that regard, and I was wondering, like, even in Capital, which is just very much focused on, like you said, the broader economic, system, he spends, like, I don't know, a couple hundred pages talking about the factory laws and the backs and forth between the owners and the workers and that whole history, and he also talks a lot about, like, the individual, like, alienation within the factory, and I don't know, so I was just...
Well, good question. The question is about how do I square what I've been saying with what Marx does in Capital. Notice up until this time I have said relatively little about Marx. I talk a lot about Engels, but I haven't talked much about Marx. I would agree with you. I think, as I read Marx's Capital, it is heavily focused on precisely the relationships in production, which requires me, since that's what it says to me, to ask the question, why did all of these great socialist thinkers and leaders in the second half of the 19th and most of the 20th century, why did they not read it the way I read it? What's going on? Why the different interpretation? Now I understand, as I hope all of you do, that with all books, with all pieces of work, they're interpreted differently by different people under different circumstances at different times. So you have to ask the question. So the way I would answer it is, I think that Marx, and he was not the only one, were in fact very interested. Even Robert Owen was very interested in how a factory worked and the intricacies of those relationships as central to a social change. But it wasn't the major theme of the time. It wasn't what was in the air. It wasn't the kind of ideas that swept people along. And so those interpretations, those elements in the Marxian canon, kind of fell by the way. There were people who noticed them, there were people who wrote about them and talked about them. But the larger picture, which other writings of Marx and Engels themselves supported, were on this macro level. I mean, let me be as dramatic as I can. When close and very well-respected students of Marx, like Lenin, made a revolution in 1917 in Russia, their central focus was on seizing the property of the private capitalists and suppressing the market in favor of planning. They were caught up, even though if you read Lenin's work, full of detailed analysis of Marx's writings. Lenin is a very close student, much as any of us ever would be, maybe more so. But he too was caught up in what socialism of that time meant. And believe me, if you go around the world today and you talk to most of the people involved in socialist parties, not all, but most of them, they will tell you quite a bit and talk quite a bit and advocate quite a bit for the socialization and nationalization of this or that. I was on a radio program not too long ago in which people who think of themselves as socialists asked me what to do about the BP scandal in the Gulf of Mexico. And before I could even answer, they told me the answer they wanted. We should socialize BP. And I remember thinking, that is the dumbest idea I ever heard. This is a company in deep trouble that has debts up the wazoo, and the government that took this over would inherit a level of debt that would be taken over when it's doing well. Don't take it over. What are you doing? What? And look, they listened to me and they scratched their heads. But it was that instantaneous notion, take it over. Government should take it over, as if therein lay some magic, profound something that you really have to go to and worry about the details kind of later. And I'm not criticizing it. There's reasons to do that, but I want you to see how socialism came to mean that kind of thing. And the same thing with planning. The same thing with planning. Socialists thought it was good that the United States government came in and took over when capitalism collapsed in 2007 and 2008. All kinds of my friends consider themselves socialists. Thought this was a real step in the right direction. It brought a social dimension to economic controls and economic decisions. And I think that comes out of this history. And let me turn then, I'm going to bring you back to this issue, believe me, but let me turn and approach it through a discussion of the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Yeah.
One quick question. This taste for utopianism and the Illinois New Leonard and those type of experiments turn Marxists off to the idea of creating on a micro level institutions that would represent what the socialism might look like.
Yes. Everywhere that I know of in the world, that happened. It was so bad, I mean, I'm going to overstate it because I feel strongly about it. It was so bad that occasionally Marxist leaders, noticing the kind of gut-level antipathy to all of these experiments, that noted leaders like Lenin, famous one, went and gave a special series of speeches in Russia right after the revolution, explaining to the militants in the Soviet Union the importance of studying and building alliance with co-ops and with the entire co-op movement. Now, one of the ways that a criticism of capitalism has mushroomed all over the world is the movement to build cooperative enterprises, co-ops of all sorts. There are a dozen co-op organizations in the United States. There are tens of thousands of functioning co-ops today in the United States, and we've had them since the beginning of our history. That too is a part of an anti-capital, but you need a socialist movement that embraces, moves towards that. Otherwise, yes. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to in my life where this effort to build a little something is poo-pooed because it's distracting people from the struggle with the state to transform the policy. And I've always wondered, what is this? You need both those things. Why should we have this debate? For me, it always struck me like the debate I used to encounter on the left. What's the most fundamental contradiction? That between white and non-white people, between men and women, between women. What is this? It's like asking me what's the best way to eat? Knife and fork, chopsticks, fingers. These are not best ways. What kind of question is this? These are different ways people go about doing things. These are different contradictions. But a context over the relative size of these things reminds me of what little boys do on the playground when they worry about the relative size of something else. But I don't believe it. Okay. This business about a Marxist or a socialist analysis or critique of the Soviet Union. That's what we're going to do because we want to draw lessons for the left from this experience. Much of the last 20 years since the Soviet Union fell apart has seen lots of obituaries written by the enemies of socialism and by the enemies of communism and by the enemies of the Soviet Union. They have lots of explanations. They were economically inefficient. They were insufficiently democratic. They didn't have civil liberties. They had top-down decision-making. You know them, because you've all learned them. But how many of you have encountered a systematic Marxist or socialist critique of the Soviet Union? There are many few. They're there. They've always been there. But they're much harder to find, much typically less well-developed, less numerous for sure, not published by people who spread it everywhere. But it's really crucial because if we don't do that, then there will not be lessons for us. Books will be written and analyses will be made, but drawing lessons for people with very different interests from those of us who would like to see a better outcome the next time an anti-capitalist upsurge produces an experiment like that. Okay. I also want to stress that the Soviet Union, even though I don't have time to say it, has been the model for the other socialist experiments in the world. It's very important that you understand. That's true of China, Cuba, Vietnam, the abortive shorter efforts, for example, in Africa, by Nkrumah in Ghana, by Sekou Touré in Guinea, by Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and so on. So this model, with its primary focus on the macro, on the state, on socialized property, on economic planning, all of that has been a hallmark. They've disagreed, and the Russians and the Chinese came to blows, etc. So they disagreed, but they disagree on variations on one theme. And that's why it's so important to analyze the Soviet Union, because what we learn about that will apply to those others as well. So now let's turn, for a few minutes, then we'll take a break, but let's turn now and begin our analysis of what happened in the Soviet Union, looking at it with the theoretical apparatus that we've been using throughout these sessions. I'm going to start with agriculture, and then I'm going to talk about industry, and then I'm going to talk about households, because we've done the work that allows me to do that. First, agriculture. Agriculture is the first thing to talk about, because the overwhelming majority of the people in Russia who made a revolution were farmers, before the revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution. This was a country with an excess of 90 to 95% of people living in rural areas dependent on agriculture. That has to be the place to start. What did the revolution do? The revolution had a slogan: bread, peace, and land. Bread to feed the people, peace because they were in the middle of World War I and it was killing huge numbers of Russians. So by committing to peace, then they would withdraw from the war, and that would save all the people from dying. And land, that was the next one, land. Russia had a vast population of former serfs. Serfdom in Russia only stopped a few decades earlier, in the 1850s. So you had people who were, in fact, still serfs, or desperate people that had been thrown off the feudal manners when serfdom ended. Terrible shortage of land, and the revolution said, very important you understand, we will distribute land to the mass of the working people in agriculture. No one had ever done that before. That was an unthinkable revolutionary act. Take the land from those with large holdings and distribute it to the mass of the Russian peasantry. That's what the Soviet Revolution did. So let me stress. It distributed land to the people. It established the private property in land. Land was the most important means of production. So the notion that the Soviet Revolution is a revolution made against private property is only a statement made by people who have no idea what happened, which is the majority of people, I admit, who make statements on this topic. They did not overthrow private property in agriculture. You're going to see they did in industry, but not in agriculture. Agriculture was much the most important. They created a mass of smallholders. Everybody got a small piece. Smallholding peasants. This was crucial, it turned out, because without having done that, there'd be no USSR. Because what saved the revolution was the understanding in millions and millions of small farmers' minds that the day that revolution is overthrown is the day they lose the land the revolution gave them. And that's why when the United States, France, Britain, and Japan invaded the USSR shortly after the revolution to destroy the new government, they failed. And that's why when the United States, Britain, France, and Japan funded a white army, a civil war inside Russia to overthrow the new government, they failed too. They failed because none of these players understood, given Russian history, what it meant to distribute land to all the peasants. So it produced a self-employed, smallholder, private-owned, private enterprise peasant. Very important as the basis of the Soviet economic system. Industry. What happened in industry? Completely different. In industry, Lenin and his colleagues did what the socialism we've been talking about led them to think was the thing to do. They took the property away from the private owners of the means of production, who were partly Russian and partly foreign, because a great part of the Russian industry, which was relatively small and very new, was foreign-owned. Particularly France, but other countries owned factories in Russia and so on. The revolutionary government took it over. Foreigners, domestic, and they made it state property. They socialized the means of production. The second thing they did was to repress markets. They never repressed them altogether. They always allowed markets to function all over the place. So again, any notion that, oh, we have revolution, and revolution against markets is only ignorance sustains this kind of thing. But only people who really never spend 15 minutes reading history would say such a silly thing. They always made use of markets. But they made use of markets under a kind of overarching control that was planning. That's true enough. They made planning dominant. And they planned. They planned who would produce what. They planned who would ship what portion of his or her output to what other place in the economy. They planned the distribution of resources and the distribution of the products of output of production. So it was a planned economic system which made use of markets, particularly again in industry. What are we going to call this system? Well, in agriculture, the language we would use if we borrowed from Marx is what he called the ancient class structure. It's not a capitalist class structure. Nobody's hiring anybody. Everybody's a little peasant who works on his or her own farm with his or her own family. So it's not a capitalist system. Much of what they produce, they themselves consume. They don't make much use of markets either. Some, but not a lot. So this is a particular kind of economic system, self-employed, let's call it. In industry, however, we have what? We have employers and employees. Indeed, after the revolution, the workers in Soviet factories behaved and performed pretty much the way they had before. They came at 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock, they stayed until 5, they worked with the same machines on the same raw materials, producing the same output. And at the end of the day, they went home. And who collected the products for sale? The management. And who made all the decisions? Very interesting. Something called a Council of Ministers. These are government officials. They decided what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, together with the planners. And they gathered into their hands the surplus, what was produced by the workers over and above what they got paid. The Council of Ministers took that into their hands, and they decided how to make use of it, what to do with it. And they basically did 3 things. Number 1, they built industry. The commitment of Lenin, and particularly, you all know, Lenin dies within a very few years of the revolution. He has a stroke and he's out of it. And Lenin and Trotsky fight for a few years. Trotsky loses, Stalin wins, and Stalin runs the country from the late 1920s until he dies in the early 1950s. To remind you of the history. What happens in this society is very interesting. The enterprises, in terms of the relationships between the workers, here comes that point we talked about before, the workers and the people who run the enterprises, isn't so different. What has happened is the private capitalists have been pushed out of the picture. But they've been replaced by state officials who function in an analogous way. Which is why Lenin, no less, after the revolution, Lenin makes a series of speeches in which he refers to what they, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and what they've created in the years 1919, 1920, 1921. He refers to it as, his phrase, state capitalism. He says we're proud of it because it's a step for us on the way to socialism. But it isn't socialism. It's something else. That's a remarkable thing. And people who wrote this book, which I urge you to read, but it goes into all of this in great detail, we make a great deal out of what Lenin meant when he said that. State capitalism. You change the macro part of society. You socialize the industrial means of production. You have planning. But you do not change the structure of the relationships in the factory, in the office, in the store. The micro level of socialism doesn't exist. It doesn't change. It just replaces one group of people not wearing a government hat with another group of people who wear a government hat. And we're going to come back to what that means. Households. Why households? Well, we've done the work last week. The household is a place where very important production goes on. We did that. The household is a place where the class structure may exist. You may have surplus being produced. If there's a class structure in the household, then everybody in the society is shaped by that class structure every bit as much as the one in the enterprise where they go to work. So if we're going to do a class analysis, we have to look at that. People who don't think the household matters don't look at it. That's 99% of the books. But we can't do that. There's no warrant in a Marxian theory of class for not looking at the household as part of any social analysis. So let's look at what did the Soviets do about households? Because even if you don't think about it, it's still a question. What did you do? It's interesting if you did something. It's interesting if you did nothing. Let's see. What did the Russians do? First, did they do something? Answer, yes. They were very interested in the position of women and in the household. Very, very important. So they did something. What did they do? Did they look at the household as a place where there was a class structure, the way we did last week? No. As far as I can tell, never. Never. Didn't do that. But what did they look at the household? They saw the household as a place in which women were subordinated, imprisoned, and degraded. And that had to stop because the liberation of women was a central demand, publicly repeated endlessly, of the Soviet Revolution. So what did the liberation of women, as they articulated it, Lenin himself wrote about it, but others did too. What did it mean? Well, it meant fundamentally the following. The liberation of women in Russia was understood as liberating them from household work. The drudgery of household work. So households were to be transformed by the revolution. They said this in all the literatures they ever read. So that there would be no more household drudgery for women to have to perform. Women should have the same education as men. They should have the same jobs outside the household as men. They should have full equality, starting with economic equality. And to do that, you had to liberate them from the drudgery of the household. How was that to be done? Answer. Ready? The industrialization of housework. That became the program. What did it mean? Creches. Vast construction of places where there would be collective raising of babies and children. Industrial laundries. All clothing and so forth would be taken to a laundry where it would be done by workers, not by the woman at the home. Canteens, they called them, collective eating established. And all over Russia, in the early years after the revolution, these institutions were set up. To use modern language, the strategy of the Soviet Revolution for the household was to convert it from a place where you had production and consumption to a place where you only had consumption. The household was to be a place where people went and consumed things, but didn't produce anything. You know the society that has most realized today, that most realized the Soviet ideal? You! Who buy, on the way home from your job, your meal. Who don't wash anything anymore, go to a place and throw it in a laundromat. Who have someone else come in from a cleaning service and who take your kid to a daycare center. We've done it. I mean, we have a ways to go, but we've done it. And what is the universal canteen? McDonald's. Of course, it's private in our society, but don't mistake the idea. Did they anywhere try to deal with the household as a class structure that had to be changed from what it had been before to what it was? Or what had it been in Russia before? What had it been? The family was feudal, the way we talked about it last time. You had a patriarchal father, very rigid, and you had the wife who was subordinate and did the surplus and delivered it to the father. A very feudal, a very feudal class structure. So if you had had anybody to do a class analysis, they might have said, gee, we got a feudal class structure in the household. And maybe we ought to change that if we want to build communism in the larger society or socialism. They didn't think like that. They thought instead of getting rid of the class structure by getting rid of all production in the household. That was their strategy. Did everybody do that? No. There was a demand of young people, militants in the party, to reorganize households. They had the idea, not in terms of a class analysis, but a rough idea. They wanted to establish, ready, collectivist, communist households. Their idea was there's always production in a household. No matter how successful you are in industrializing, there's always work to do in a household, and that has to be done in a new Soviet way, collectively. And there's references in the book of a very famous historian at Princeton, who's the major historian of this, the efforts to build communal households in Russia by young people in the years after the revolution. Officially supported by the government, funded by Stalin, to make experiments in collective householding, lasted for the first 10 years, 1917, 1927. At the end of the 1920s, very important, Russia was experiencing extreme economic difficulties, and that was the major reason why the new government, Stalin is now in control, ended both of the things I just described. He ended the industrialization of housework, and he ended the subsidies for the collective houses. His argument was, we have all we can do to build up the industries of our society, to withstand the dangerous military encirclement of the Soviet Union by hostile forces. We have enough resources to build an industrialization of housework would take us 20 years, of huge amounts of money. We don't have it, I'm abandoning that. And we don't want all the trouble that the church and others gave to these collective households, because the young people made efforts not only in collective cooking, but in collective sexual activity, etc., etc. And that, in a society like that, it had the usual problems you can imagine. So he wanted no more trouble around that issue. So all of that was ended. And the Russian household was, pre-war, pre-revolution, the feudal Russian household was reconstructed with the blessing of the Stalin government, and with every Soviet government ever since. They recreated the feudal class structure of the household. Now, friends, if you want to make a socialist revolution, you at least have to ask the question whether you're helped or hindered in that project by having people continue to live in an exploitative, feudal class structure. The Soviets didn't even ask the question, they simply lived with the results. In the Soviet Union, then, in the first 10 years of its revolt, it established private property, smallholding agriculture, interacting with state capitalist industry, and basically in a feudal household that was relieved of some of the pressure because of industrialization of housework, but never in a very complete way, and that all ended at the end of that time. So now we're 10 years into a revolution that still calls itself a socialist revolution. But notice, what that means is state ownership of industry, that's all, and that's a minority of the means of production. Planning, that's pretty well developed, although there are plenty of markets. Private ownership in agriculture, and a pre-revolutionary basic household class structure that hasn't changed much. Into this situation arose the first great crisis of the Soviet Union. And it's worth explaining it so you see how this complicated class structure reacts to the crisis and produces that kind of Soviet Union that all of you have come to take for granted because it's what people know if they know anything about what that society was like. Here's what happened. In the countryside, there was what is called a differentiation of the peasantry. This is what happens whenever you have agriculture in which you have lots of little small individual holders. The normal ups and downs of life are devastating in this kind of a system. If you get sick, you can't throw the seeds out, you can't harvest. If you don't get sick, you can. The peasant who gets sick collapses, cannot function as a peasant, will die because he couldn't raise crops or keep his animals. And so what does he do to make this story simple? He does the only thing he can do to survive. He sells his piece of land, which he had the right as its private property of his own to do. He sells it to a neighboring peasant who's more successful, who didn't get sick, where the rain fell appropriately, where the sun shone, etc. And then, having sold the land, he can live for a while, but not for very long, off the proceeds of the sale. So what's left to him, here we go now, he approaches the peasant to whom he sold his land and says, "Let me work for you." In that act, repeated a million times in the Soviet countryside, you began to have in agriculture the development of private capitalism. An individual private peasant hiring another human being to produce on the land that had become that of the employing peasant. This is a differentiation. Some peasants, the ones who are not successful, become rural or agricultural proletarians, people who sell their labor power, and those they sell the labor power to become capitalists, small capitalists, to be sure, rural capitalists, but capitalists. And they were very harsh with these serfs that they had hired, former serfs, and they got a terrible name in Soviet culture to represent how harsh they were. They were known as the peasants of the fist. The Russian word for fist, kulak. The kulak is the farmer, the fisted farmer, who is becoming rich by accumulating slowly. Others like himself who didn't have good luck and who had to become his workers. As they became richer, these were the ones, of course, who had the produce to sell to the cities. Because they were the ones with workers who produced more than they themselves consumed. Most little families that worked their own piece of land consumed pretty much all they grew. So the people who were becoming the suppliers of food and raw materials to the industry that was being built up to save Russia, to enable it to survive, that food and those raw materials were coming from a group of people who were private capitalists and who began to say to the government, why should we sell you our surplus, our produce? You don't produce anything we want. In exchange, we better have a better time living off the fat of the land. Literally what they said. But what do you want from us, the government said, because the government was desperate. If it couldn't get food to feed the workers in the city, there'd be no industrial production. If it didn't get raw materials, there'd be no industrial production. They couldn't build their industry. So the whole plan of the Soviet Union turned out to depend on these private capitalist Polak farmers developing in the countryside. Well, they said, we'll give you our surplus, but we want you to produce the things we like. It's called light industry, consumer goods, household furnishings, material for transportation in the rural area, all of that. But that wasn't what the Russians did. They wanted to build a hydroelectric system, rail system, heavy industry, munitions for their military. It didn't work. In order to please them, to keep them sending food and raw materials, you'd have to do an industrialization that was different from what they wanted. But if you didn't do it, if you did the industrialization you wanted as a Soviet planner, then they wouldn't send you the food and the raw materials. What are you going to do? Stalin makes a decision. Trotsky basically endorsed the decision about a year or so earlier. Got rid of Trotsky, and then he did pretty much what Trotsky had advocated anyway. But they both agreed in the end that they would take a very dangerous step for Soviet society. Remember what I told you? The Soviet Revolution had survived from the support of the peasants because they had their own piece of land. In Soviet language, this was called the Great Worker-Peasant Alliance. Russian word Smichka, S-M-Y-T-C-H-K-A, alliance. Stalin broke the alliance. Terrible risk to take. And instituted a policy in 1929 called the collectivization of agriculture. He basically moved the peasants into large units. No more each peasant has his own piece. Now you are going to be in a big farm with dozens or maybe even hundreds or in some cases thousands of peasant families in two kinds of units. One is called a collective farm, kolkhoz, and the other one is called a state farm. The state farm runs like state capitalist industry. The government sends in the managers, hires lots of people. They are workers, they just work in agriculture. So that's state capitalism in the rural area. That was the smaller kind of unit that they developed. Most farmers were herded together. By the way, farmers resisted violently. Many were killed. It was a terrible time. When you hear stories of Stalin killed millions, what people are referring to were the 2 or 3 years, late 28, 29, 1930, that this all happened, and it was a kind of a forced collectivization of agriculture. When the dust settled, the mass of farmers were in something called collective farms. Remember, please, again, so you understand the complexity of history as opposed to that caricature of what passes for knowledge of the Soviet Union. Collective farms were the private owners of the land. The private owners of the land. They would need the private owners of their equipment and their animals as well. Again, obliterated private property. Not true. Not true. The state farms, that was the land was owned by the state. But the kolkhoz, the collective farms, which were much the larger one of the two, were privately owned. And they were collectively run. You actually had in Russia, for a while, on some of the collective farms, a genuine communist organization. The workers collectively produced a surplus. They got together and they collectively decided what to do with the surplus they themselves had produced. That is the closest the Soviet Union ever came to instituting at the level of the micro, the organization of production, a communist class structure. A situation in which the people who appropriated the surplus were the same people as those who produced it. Not a different group. Not one group producing the surplus or another. That means, in Marxian language, no exploitation in the collective farms that were organized that way. So the irony, for those of you who find this difficult, that's the way life is. The leader who instituted the only short-term experiment on a mass scale of communism in Russia was Joseph Stalin. Not anybody else, not Lenin, Stalin. And that's not because Stalin's a good guy and Lenin isn't, it's because of what I just told you, the history of how this evolved. For the rest of the Soviet history until it collapses in 1989, agriculture is in those two forms, collective farms and state farms. But over the period from 1930 to 1989, the collective farm portion shrinks and the state farm portion expands. So by the end of the Soviet Union, the state capitalism you had always had in industry was replicated by a state capitalism in agriculture as well. Very important that you understand that. And throughout, with a feudal household.
Why does that happen?
The best guess I can make is that the Kolkhozs represented an independent power source that made Stalin real nervous. He had to do it. He felt he had to do these private collective farms. By the way, no sooner had he established these private collective farms than basically the massive farmers, having been forcibly put together, went on a kind of strike. They refused to function, and these collective farms were not producing the food and raw material for the cities and industrialization. That was the whole idea. So he had to make a compromise. And the compromise he made was to give every farmer on a collective farm his own individual club. And the same thing was done on the state farms. Very bizarre units. You were working most of the time with the other farmers on the collective farm lands. But you were allotted a small piece which you and your wife and your children could cultivate. And of course, since you kept all of the produce of the private farm, that's where all your creativity, all your intensity, and all your effort went. And they had to allow markets in the produce of the private plots, so that Russians would all gather once a week or twice a week, selling each other vegetables and eggs and all the other things that they did on there. But it was an accommodation to what had existed before. The self-employed little farmer got his own little piece, even within the collective farm. It was felt that was a necessary way to manage it. And because the collective farms were their own decision makers, it became a problem for Stalin, which he resolved by slowly shrinking them and expanding the state farms, which came directly under the ministries that the government ran, or not had no private state. Yeah.
Well, I guess it seems to be like part of the contradiction is that Marx always identified the working class rather than the peasantry as being the agent for socialism, because peasants don't have collective interests in the same way that we're presumed because they need like their own private land.
Well, you be careful. You really got to be careful, because the term peasant is a dangerous term to use. Basically, a peasant is the name we give to a person who works on the land, a rural person, an agricultural person. It's not a class term, because you have to ask the person who works on the land, do they own the land? Do they work for somebody else on the land? The class relationship on the land can be capitalist, in which case using the word peasant, both for the one who owns his own and for the one who works as a laborer for somebody else, is not a Marxian category. You really shouldn't do that, because it doesn't work with the Marxian analytic.
I guess I mean people that do own their own small pieces of land, per se. I guess to me that just points to like why I think the term state capitalism is appropriate. But I think there was a difference, in my opinion, like Lenin and Trotsky at the beginning of the revolution saw that as like a necessity, and they expected the revolution to spread. They saw it as a temporary necessity. Whereas Stalin, I think, made sort of reworked his own theory in order to consolidate like the bureaucracy, socialism in one country and all the rest of it.
I think that's probably true. I think Stalin made a political decision at the end of the 1920s that the mass of Russian people had been through unbelievable sacrifice. They lost more than anybody else in World War I. They then had a revolution, then they had a civil war, and they had a foreign invasion. I mean, it was too much. And yet they came roaring back. Within 7 or 8 years, they had rebuilt an economy producing pretty much what it had been producing before World War I. Tremendous at the sacrifice of a whole generation of people to build socialism. I think Stalin worried politically. Now, how long can you ask people to sacrifice everything for a socialism that is not yet here? So you either have to change your analysis. Tell people honestly, it's going to take us 30 years. It's going to take us 15 years, which would have been a dangerous thing, having said that it's going to come. Or you have another option. You announce its arrival. That's what Stalin did. We have it. We can have socialism in one country. We can do it. And so your sacrifice will have paid off. I think it was much more a political decision about where people's heads were at than it was a technical decision about economic development. Anyway, let me continue because we're going to run out of time. Basically, in the Soviet Union, here's what happened. The government took the surplus that they got from industry, Because remember, they're the Council of Ministers. They get the surplus into their hands. And they use it, as I told you, for three purposes. Number one, they built up their heavy industry. Just a footnote for those of you that may not be aware of this. The Soviet Union went from 1917, a backward country to begin with, decimated by a world war, it lost, by a civil war, by a revolution, and by a foreign invasion. Compromised less than 10 years later by a collectivization of agriculture that was wildly disruptive. Given all of that, and being the most backward country in Europe to begin with, by 1980, it was the world's second superpower. It overcame all of that, and another world war in the 1930s and 40s. That is a stunning record of economic development. If you want to know why Russia has been an important model in the world, it's not about its ideological commitments. It's about its absolutely unprecedented economic success in developing a modern industrial economic system. It was stunning, and it remains a stunning example with very few parallels. Indeed, one of the very few parallels in the world is China. And there's no accident. Very important to keep in mind. So they took a large part of the surplus and they devoted it to building up their industry, which they did. Number two, the second use made of the surplus was as a kind of social dividend to the mass of workers, a reward for support of socialism. What did that mean? They took the wealth that was produced out of industry, a portion of it, and they provided subsidized housing, subsidized education, subsidized medical care, all of that. Collectively consumed goods that are very basic to a modern standard of living. That was a second use. And the third use was military, to build up a modern superpower on the basis of a very poor country with very limited resources. That took an enormous amount. So it was always in the Soviet Union a dicey question. Would you get enough surplus out of your workers so that you could fund the different parts of what kept you going as a society? You had to build up your industry, otherwise you could not survive in the face of the Western capitalist world that was always growing. You could not survive if you didn't deliver to your mass of people collective consumption to compensate them for the enormous sacrifices they had made and were continuously being called upon to make. World War I, collectivization, World War II, so forth. And number three, you had to devote everything to an arms race with the West that became particularly intense twice. First with the buildup of Hitler in Germany as a threat, and then no sooner was that over than the Cold War with the United States. So it was always a touch and go question in Russia whether they could get enough surplus to do all these three things. They were successful from the end of the war to the mid-70s. That was the mid-70s is the epogee, the best the Russians ever achieved. They really were extraordinarily powerful. So powerful that they were able to get the United States to change from a position of direct hostility into that weird, let us both coexistence and all of that stuff. So, an agreement to arm ourselves to the teeth, but not actually do it. But it cost them an enormous, there was no slack. This is an economy that has to squeeze all the surplus it get, that's why it could never really raise the wages. Couldn't. Because then the surplus wouldn't have been there to take care of the other needs. So it couldn't really raise the standard of living. It was desperate because it couldn't keep up with the arms race with the West, because the West is too rich. It did grow its industry very quickly, that was its priority, and it did that. But it was always in a danger. And here's how the danger blew up. They were so concerned, the dialectic, it's beautiful Hegel and Marx, they were so concerned to manage their arms race with the West. And remember, they had been through 2 world wars, they knew what war was, they had a horror of it that's hard for people in other countries to kind of grasp and come through it like that. So they were determined to build up a military that would, but they knew they couldn't match the West, and it was draining money from industrialization and from giving their people a decent standard of living. So when the West made a deal for détente, for coexistence, they jumped. And as part of that deal, each side was to begin exchanging violinists and arts troupes and classes, and to open each society up. And neither side understood what that would do. The consumerism of the West that had built up over 100 years, particularly in the United States, had no analog in Russia. They didn't have refrigerators and stoves and cars and boats, none of it. On the other hand, they had collective consumption. They had subsidized education, subsidized medical care. They had all kinds of things that the Westerners didn't have, but they didn't have private consumption. And what the Russians suddenly saw, starting in the 70s, was standards of living they hadn't thought existed in the world. And they wanted them. They wanted them big time. And they began to put enormous pressure on the Soviet system to provide them. Remember, Soviet ideology to its own people had portrayed workers in the West as downtrodden, oppressed, and mistreated, which they were, but they got kind of carried away and had never quite represented the standard of living that an American worker could afford. And so they weren't ready. And it put a new demand on the Soviet Union that it couldn't meet. It did not have enough surplus if it was going to give its workers a standard of private consumption that would allow them to continue industrialization, fund the military, and provide the collective. They couldn't do it. And the society dissolved. It's a long story. It's in this book in great detail if you're interested. It could not manage, in class terms, it could not get out the surplus from its people big enough to take care of the conditions to reproduce that society, so it fell apart. That's why it didn't implode with a big violent revolution or anything like that. There was a society that could not function. It's a little bit like what's happening in the United States. Nobody is attacking the United States. Iraq is not our enemy, and Afghanistan doesn't threaten us. Our problems are internal. It's the inability to put together 30 million under or unemployed people, and unmet social needs, and unused capacity. It's a country that's going through more and more difficulty through an implosion of its own ability to function, and that's what happened to the Soviet Union. Analysis. Was the Soviet Union inefficient? Stupid question. There were areas of low efficiency, and there were areas of high efficiency. They were very efficient in industrialization. They still produce some of the best weapons in the world because they spent so much on the military. Their agriculture is a disaster. But that's exactly true in any society. There are areas of high efficiency, areas of low efficiency. It's a very strange argument to imagine. The Soviet Union didn't grind down because government-owned enterprises are inherently inefficient. That's an analysis that is made by the enemy. The people who make that analysis attack Soviet industries before 1989, during the collapse, and afterwards. You don't need to do any historical work. They're just repeating their critique. To measure the efficiency of something, let me remind you, I've done this with you several times. To measure the efficiency of something, you look at all of the positive things that come from it and all of the negative ones. Then you weigh them. If the positive ones are larger than the negative ones, you declare something to be efficient. Very nice idea. It has two theoretical flaws that render it nonsense. Number one, what are the effects, say, of government enterprise as opposed to private enterprise? The answer is there are millions of them. There are a million today, and they last into the future. You don't know what they all are. Nobody does. Nobody could know them all. And therefore, nobody can measure them all. Nobody can put all of them in a nice file. Good results, bad results, weigh them up, weigh them back, compare them. This is a fanciful idea. No one's ever done that, so it's not doable. And besides that, even if you knew what the effects were, here's hot news for you. The effect of having a private enterprise as opposed to a state enterprise, that effect is never attributable just to the question of whether it's private or public. Suppose, for example, 200 people get injured more in a state enterprise than a private enterprise producing the same thing. Is that because it's a state enterprise? Of course not. That has to do with climate, electricity, air quality, instruction manuals, a million factors. You can't attribute it to the one or the other. To measure the efficiency of two things, to compare them, that's a fantasy. That doesn't exist. That's exactly like certain propositions about the fairy queen who lives right behind this blackboard and who is controlling everything I say. That's the same standard as a notion of efficiency. The only interesting question is why people believe in efficiency. Just like the only interesting question about the debates in the High Middle Ages about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is not the effort to resolve the question. We're only interested in how come smart people ask that question. Well, in the not very distant future, people will wonder, what the hell was this horse shit about efficiency? What is that? Nobody can do that. Nobody can measure all the costs and all the benefits from anything. And nobody ever has. The claim that you did so is an attempt to beat another person into submission. My thing is more efficient than yours. That's what this is about. You hope a person will buy what you're selling because you've attached to it the label efficient. But it has exactly the same standard as Jesus prefers it. You need to believe that, but there's nothing there other than your belief. Okay. What did the Soviet Union collapse teach us? Well, I want to hammer now at what's been implicit all along. The Soviet Union never transformed, with the exception of the collective farms, some of them, for a while, but I explained to you. It never, on a wholesale, society-wide basis, changed the micro-level organization of production. They did not set up enterprises or convert existing enterprises into a different organization such that the people who produced the surplus, say Monday through Thursday, gathered in the factory or the office on Friday and sat around making the decisions what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits or the surplus. They didn't do that. If I had been one of them, I probably wouldn't have done it either. That was not in people's heads. That's the lesson. So they didn't change the micro-level organization of production, just like they made decisions for interesting and understandable reasons not to change the class structure of households. But now my punchline. Having not changed the micro-level of socialist society, in the enterprise, in the household, the Soviet Union discovered that even when you make the most historic changes at the macro level, if they don't have a partner at the micro level, they will not survive. The Soviet Union socialized property in the last 20 years, it gave it back to the private sector. The Soviet Union's subordinated markets to planning, they have now reversed that. It's the old story with which we began today, reform and revolution. They reformed the Soviet Union. They changed the organization of property. It's very important. It changed the market planning dialectic. Very important. But they didn't change something else, and that proved to be very important. That's a lesson for us to learn. It's not that we should disregard planning and property. Not at all. Those are important parts of society. Marxists have taken the lead in making that point over and over again. But they haven't taken the lead in understanding the need for a transformation at the micro level. Even though I would argue, as per your question, that if you actually read all Marx's Capital, he's very concerned about the micro level. Actually more concerned about it than about those other questions of property and planning. Never wrote about planning, hardly a word. The sides of it. Last point. Why do I do all this? Because I'm interested in the Soviet Union? No. I mean, I am, but that's not my reason. And it's not even that I want you to draw lessons. I would like to make a political point. The macro-focused socialisms and communisms of the first 150 years of that negation of capitalism we call socialism, communism, etc., was very successful. In 1850, there were very few socialists and communists in the world. You probably could have collected most of them in this building. 50 years later, every single country on earth has Marxist this, and Marxist that, and socialist this, and communist that. It's extraordinary. The literature has been globally translated, and it's a stunning story. Not to argue that Marxism isn't weak in the world today, it is. But you have to keep that in perspective. Something extraordinary has happened over the last 150 years. So I am not a Monday morning quarterback saying that this macro focus didn't have the power to incite people, to inspire people, to motivate struggles, many of which were very successful, and that changed the world. All of that's true. But I don't think those struggles then give us the blueprint for the struggles we have to make now. We have to learn not only what those succeeded in doing, but what they failed. And the story of the Soviet Union was a success and a failure. And the failure came later. And that failure that dissolved it had fundamentally to do with their blindness, their inability to see, let alone evaluate, the need for micro-level socialist transformations. I also think that the working classes in the world today, if we're going to win them to a renewed interest in socialism and communism, of the thought their grandparents and great-grandparents had, then we have to offer something that will mean something more to them than what the old formulas seem to mean to them, which isn't a lot these days. Imagine then the attractive power of a new formulation of socialism which says to workers that this new kind of socialism has a crucial, central, ongoing role for you where you work. That place that you spend most of your time as an adult, 5 out of the 7 days a week, 9 to 5, that's where you are. We're going to invite you to a socialism which transforms the workplace, which gives you all a new job description. Not only the particular task you do, but participation in the decisions, all of them that operate your life. You will be a new person. You will have a whole new range of responsibilities, a whole new range of skills, a whole new range of powers. And imagine with me if working places were organized that way, and if they partnered with communities, residential areas, that were likewise organized as democratic, self-governing units. You would then have a natural alliance between the self-governing enterprise and the self-governing communities in which these enterprises live and work, and they together would produce the surplus delivered to the macro. And that would give the base a real power over the state and the macro, as well as vice versa. We begin to have that balance between the macro and the micro that might help us avoid the abuse of power at the macro level that has haunted every socialism and communism we've yet constructed, that we have to deal with. And here's an economically grounded way to perhaps do it. Rethinking socialism through the lens of an advanced, sophisticated class analytic theory that allows you to re-examine the history and draw new lessons from it is surely a central way to design a new kind of socialism and Marxism that can make a difference in the next century, something like what the old macro-focused socialism was able to do in the last century. But if we don't make these adjustments, we will continue to look at what is now in the world a stunning disconnect. Capitalism that does not function, that is decimating the lives of millions of people, and no anti-capitalist movement here in the United States worth talking about. Those that exist are small and weak, and we know the population needs it. I can personally tell you the population is more open to it than it has been in this country in half a century, if not longer. But we lack the programmatic, organized way to bring that together into the social movement it could become. And part of that problem is developing a new kind of conception of socialism. And that's why the lesson of this course and of looking at this history is so important. Folks, I am sorry, but we have run out of time. Thank you very much for coming. I will be doing more of these classes at the Brecht. In the fall, particularly, we're going to have a monthly meeting where I and others that I will bring with me will give updates on what's happening in the U.S. and world economies, since it's going to be very intense over the next 6 months. I don't know if you saw it, but let me conclude. This afternoon, the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a special committee within the United States Federal Reserve, which has the job of buying and selling securities. You know, the Federal Reserve prints the money. They print the money and then they pump it into the economy by means of what this committee does. It released a statement today saying that the economic prospects in the United States have turned, using their language, I have to kind of read through the sentence, the economic situation has turned so bad in terms of what's coming down the pipe that their plans for what they need to do have to be altered. The new problem, they make a very strong hint, isn't inflation, it's deflation. And they are going to lower interest rates, which is stunning since they're just barely above zero if anything. They're going to lower interest rates, they're going to buy more bad mortgages than they've already bought. They're going to pump the economy up with even more money than they have pumped because it is so bad how things look and how grim they look going forward. Now, they don't use that language, but please go look at the statement. You'll see it. You can get it on your Google any way you want. It was released this afternoon. It's called the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, that released this statement. But it is a real admission. By the way, for all of you to understand, a deflation is a period of generalized price fall. Try to remember, the United States is a deeply indebted country. Consumers are indebted, business is indebted, government is indebted. What happens to the burden of your debt when prices fall? The debt is fixed in dollar amount. If all prices fall, that includes your income. So your income is falling, but the debt is fixed. That means that the portion of your income that the debt takes rises. That's going to drive everybody into bankruptcy who isn't there already. It's going to make it impossible to pay your house mortgage or any of your other debts. And at that point, the abyss opens again. So we don't know what's going to happen. I can't predict the future, but it is very interesting when the government, which tries always to be the cheerleader for the economy, they think that's what they should do. It's called jawboning. It's when you talk up the economy. Even they today, because they have to prepare the population, things are in deep doo-doo. And not only here, but in Europe. That is a technical term. Only with people like me with a PhD in economics can say doo-doo. Thank you very much. Today what we're going to deal with is a systematic and theoretically informed analysis of socialism and communism. Topics that have been difficult to deal with in a systematic and theoretically sophisticated way for a long time. Basically, the Cold War made it impossible for most of the last half-century, in the sense that all that anybody seemed interested in was which side were you on. You tended to have people who didn't like the Soviet Union denouncing everything, and those who felt protective towards the Soviet Union celebrating everything. And it was very hard in that process to come up with, on either side, anything like a reasonable effort to see what that extraordinary experiment running from 1917 to 1989, the longest lasting so far, that may change, but the longest lasting experiment in putting socialism into practice on a mass scale in an entire and large country that we have. And so it's an important experiment to understand. But before jumping into that, what I want to do is talk in a more general way about socialism and communism. I'm going to start talking about them together. As we go along, you'll see how they become differentiated and what the differentiation between those two terms means. But first of all, looking at them together, I think it's best to see socialism and communism as the kind of shadow of capitalism. That is, it's what in fancy language you might call capitalism's other half, other side, shadow, irremovable presence that capitalism doesn't want but cannot ever separate itself from. Marx is a product of capitalism settling in Europe. If you look at his personal history, if you look at his timing of his life, he's literally a product of capitalism at that time, and most of socialist movements, organizations, and individuals have been products of emerging literally out of capitalism as it evolves. I think it's important to see that, and perhaps the best way I know of to put it is something like this. Every institution, large and small, has in our society and in past societies people who love it and people who hate it. And the dialectic, the contradictions of societies make it not all that surprising that that would be true. There are, for example, an awful lot of families or kinship groups in which some people admire and love that institution and some people hate it. Some people locate their good points in the institution that they got, and some their bad points. It is not surprising, it is not unusual that any social system breeds, if you like, its critics and its advocates, its admirers and its detractors. And capitalism has always done that. By the way, slavery did that. Those who extolled it as a wonderful, same thing in feudalism. To have the serf have more of the fruits of his own labor, to be less oppressed by the lord, to be less required to make payments to the lord, and so on. In capitalism, there's a group of critics who demand higher wages, better working conditions, improved pensions, subsidized housing. You know the list. Demands for the improvement. Then there's another group, a second group of critics. Their concern is not primarily with improving the conditions of the mass of people within a society. They're interested in transforming that society, changing it systematically. And their arguments are roughly the following. The system breeds the bad conditions. Even if it were possible to improve the conditions of the mass of people within the system itself will undo the very reforms, you see where the language is coming, that you can achieve. Those good or better conditions will always be dependent on how the system is working and how the people who run the system feel about those conditions. Or to say it real simply, to raise wages in a system that's a wage system always allows for the time to come when the wages will be reduced. You haven't institutionalized your improved situation. You haven't made it the system. You have left the system in place so that the improvements are always dependent on the system. Or to say the same thing using the passionate language that usually gets involved here, consider the struggle between those who were critical of American slavery in our South, who demanded better conditions for the slave. Now imagine yourself in the presence of a room where a John Brown or someone like that tears his hair out and screams, the problem is not to improve the condition of slaves, the problem is slavery, and that's an abomination that has to be ended. It's not how we treat the slave, it's that there is such a thing as a slave, which is intolerable. And Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slave. He did not spend a lot of time passing laws to improve the conditions of slaves. In the intensity of the Civil War, he simply said, there is no such thing, and the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits slavery as an absolute. Well, not quite. If you read that passage, that amendment, the 14th, It allows, it bans slavery everywhere except in prisons. That's still the law of the United States. We can have slavery in prison. There are actually several places where we have slavery that are allowed by law, but in general it's banned. Okay? So, in the history of capitalism, the same thing. There are those who want, often in the name of socialism or communism, or not using those names, it's not necessary, they're not the only names, but this group of critics want to improve the condition of working people in Canada. Higher wages, better working conditions, more civil liberties, you name it, you know them all. And then there's another group who sometimes take the name of socialism and communism, sometimes don't, for whom the issue isn't to improve the condition of workers in capitalism. The problem is there ought not to be workers in capitalism. There shouldn't be people who depend on others to hire them for their life. The workers should not be in that situation any more than the slaves should be the property of another person. And that's the issue. Now, often, these two groups collaborate. They see a commonality. Those who want to improve work on that. And side by side, those who want to revolutionize the system, transform the system. So, if you like, to make permanent the reforms, to guarantee the reforms, to embed them in a different system, those people work on that project and they work together. And if you want, you could use names like reformists, for those who want to improve the condition, and revolutionaries, those who want to change the system, and they work together. They consider their two goals, their two foci, their two projects, as what you might call a short-term and a long-term project, or a smaller and immediate and a larger and social project. There are various ways that they build a coalition and work together. They can even have fun, as when the reformists turn to the society they're trying to change and say, you better give us the reforms we're demanding, or else you'll have to deal with those other people, and they want a lot more. That game is played all the time. But even more often, they do not get together. They do not cooperate. They criticize one another. The reformists attack the revolutionaries. You want the whole thing. There's not going to be a revolution. We don't have the strength. The other side is invulnerable. It's too dangerous. It's too horrible. Whatever the reasons. And therefore, what's achievable is reform. So stop wasting everybody's time waving the slogans and storming the barricades. You can't get that, and it is foolish and dangerous to try. On the other side, the revolutionaries. You don't know what's achievable. You don't know how vulnerable this system is. You don't know what is possible. All you're doing is giving up what we really need and going for small potatoes. And being really happy if you get them. And mobilizing masses of people to spend enormous effort to get something that isn't secure. And you're only gonna depress them, frustrate them, and turn them off. Not only will they not be militants for the revolution, you won't even keep them as militants for the reform. You reformers need us to be here every bit as much as we need you to be there. And why would the revolutionary admit the reform is necessary? Because reform is something people can immediately see. They can immediately benefit from. They may get active in a particular political movement around immediate issues much quicker than they might get around the bigger, more abstract, more total kind of change. So maybe getting involved in reform could be a stepping stone, a step in the process that ends up with a revolutionary. When they work together, they've looked at it that way. But their working together is always fraught with the tension of these two groups' different perspectives. And the smart people on the other side, those who wanted to keep a society going, have always understood the importance of playing on the difference between these two groups. Saying, for example, to the reformists, you're good. You're not like those dangerous people with the bombs in the back of their pocket threatening everyone. And if you're nice, and you stay as a nice reformist, here's what we're going to do. We'll give you some reforms. Smash the hell out of those revolutionaries. You don't protect the revolutionaries, we'll give you some of your reforms. How's that for a deal? Often that deal is taken. And that will help split, of course, the revolutionaries and the reformists when they don't do that to themselves. In the course of the struggles between those who want to change the system they're critical of and those who want to get rid of that system, they come to use a variety of names. One of the earliest differentiations between communists and socialists was around that issue. Socialists in general, but not always and not everywhere, but socialists in general tended to be the name increasingly used, particularly over the last century, for the more reformed criticisms of capitalism. Communists for the more revolutionary. But again, please understand, there are times and places, including today, when it doesn't work like that. When in fact what the Communist Party does is less revolutionary than what people who call themselves socialists or a socialist party do, and so on. These are very flexible, changing labels. So if you ask yourself, what does it mean, you're asking the wrong question. There is no "it means," as if there's a fixed definition of these things. The terms socialism and communism got caught up, like every other piece of language, in these conflicts, which is why I stress the history and the conflicts rather than the particular words. Okay. There are other differences in this socialism and communism that we can now talk about. First, if you go to one of the most widely influential statements of what socialism is, if you want that, it is this famous pamphlet that's on the reading list by Friedrich Engels called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's a pamphlet, it's not that terribly long, written by Engels with Marxist participation in the middle of the 19th century. And it's a very powerful attempt to really survey what socialism has meant, but from a very partisan position. Engels there and Marx are trying to welcome but also criticize a kind of socialism they think is, to use the best word I can think of, immature, underdeveloped, needing change. They recognize that it has been a powerful movement drawing in lots of people to be critical of capitalism, and for that they applaud it. But its system and those who hated it, feudalism had those, and on and on and on. For those of you that are not familiar with it, all of those systems, like capitalism, have not only provoked people to be critical, but have provoked people to try to overthrow the system, to break away from it, to destroy it. All slaveries are full of that. Whether you go to ancient Rome and you know the story of Spartacus, the rebellion against slavery that Spartacus as a slave leader undertook, or if you know American history, John Brown and what he was trying to do, and countless others, wherever slavery has existed, it has produced its supporters, its admirers, its celebrators, and its critics, and its revolutionaries. Feudalism has countless upheavals where serfs tried to get rid of the capitalism. In fact, the feudalism, one of the most famous books of Friedrich Engels is a study of what he calls the German Peasant Wars, where he talks about the role of peasant uprisings in shaping the history of German feudalism. And again, there are countless examples, and capitalism has had that as well. We will talk about the Soviet And what we say about the Soviet Union will have a lot to say about China and Eastern Europe and Cuba and so on as well, but they are really only recent, long-lived, cataclysmic uprisings against capitalism. There have been thousands of them in the long history of capitalism, wherever it has been. So in one sense, and perhaps in the most important sense, socialism and communism are words to describe that part of the spectrum of opinion in capitalism that is extraordinarily critical. And I think it is important for you to see them that way as part of an evolving social dialectic in which systems arise, provoke criticism, and eventually succumb to that criticism, which is often what happens. American slavery was overthrown by a revolt of parts of the society against that slavery. And the same is true wherever these systems have been issued. Second point. Whenever you had critics or antagonists of a system, like capitalism, and the same is true of slavery, feudalism, and so on, they typically fall into two major groups. And I think it will help us in our discussion of socialism and communism to talk briefly about what those two groups are. The first group is critical of what it sees and demands an amelioration, a softening, an improvement, progress, lots of words for it. They want the system to change to better treat the people that live in it. So, for example, in the struggles around slavery, the critics of slavery, one group of them, out of the two groups, I'll tell you the other one in a moment, one group was determined to get better diets, better clothing, better conditions, less breaking up of families, to make the experience of the slave less onerous, less awful, to improve, you might say, to be cute, to produce slavery with a human face. So it's a criticism of slavery that pushes for an improvement in the quality.